This is the United States Energy Association Power Sector Podcast, sponsored by global energy law firm Bracewell LLP. I'm Herman K. Trabish. I've covered the power sector since 2006, and I currently report for Utility Dive. Just in time for this episode of the podcast series on offshore wind, a just released Conservative Energy Network report found that offshore energy installations produce billions of dollars of ecosystem services like enhanced marine habitats and increased fisheries productivity. Today, we're going to talk to marine ecologist Anthony W.J. Bicknell about his just published paper on the impacts of offshore energy development on ocean life habitats and habits and the ecological impacts of offshore wind farms. Anthony is a senior research fellow at the UK's University of Exeter, where he's done research on marine ecology since 2018. Before that, Anthony did marine ecology research with AB Nautilus and postdoctoral research at the University of Plymouth after being awarded his PhD in 2011. So, Tony, what did your research find, and what are the implications for the impacts of offshore wind on fish populations?
Well, hi, Herman. Thanks for the introduction and inviting me to talk about my research. I'd like to start by saying that the study that we've recently published and is detailed in that paper is not in isolation at all. It's
Right.
part of a much larger project called Predators and Prey around Renewable Energy Developments, which is funded by the Crown Estate and Crown Estate Scotland and part of the Offshore Wind Evidence and Change Programme. The aim of the
Tony,
project.
excuse me. Let me just say for my U.S. listeners, uh, the Crown Estate is the source of funding for many of the offshore energy projects that the UK and Scotland, England and Scotland do. So our folks will know.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, and it's a bit of a strange setup. The Crown Estate. It's got links with monarchy, but generally the funding for that is through the Treasury in essence.
Right.
Um,
Publicly vetted. Publicly vetted.
yeah. Um, the aim of the project is to provide evidence and insights into how offshore wind farm infrastructure is affecting predators, but also their prey, as I would call it, fish. And so our paper is related to how two particular wind farms in the north of Scotland are impacting or have impacted the fish in that area.
Mm.
So the recent paper, it describes, or it's basically to assess the fine scale effect of turbine foundations on the distribution of demersal fish. And when I say demersal fish, what I mean is things like species that are spend most of their time close to the seabed.
Mm.
Things like cod or flatfish are perfect examples for us here. And the two wind farms that we did the study around were in North Scotland. They were called the Beatrice and the Moray East wind farms in the Moray Firth. And they've been operational for a number of years now. And so our idea was to look at the fine scale effect of these foundations. And so what we did is we used what a lot of people will call BRUVs, which are baited remote underwater video systems, which are basically cameras that you put down on the seabed, you put some bait in front of them, and it will track the species of that bait, and then you can observe, count, and measure the fish that you see on them. So the idea being that using the survey method, that we could determine whether there are more abundance of fish and biomass close to the turbines compared to reference areas 500 meters away and 2 kilometers away.
What did you find?
So what we found, it was a relatively simple study in the fact that we wanted to assess those effects, but we wanted to do it in a single year and a certain time point in that year. So we were removing the variation, interannual variation that you might find with fish, and we just wanted to look at the impact of the turbines. And what we found is that over 90% of the demersal fish species observed around the wind farms were either dab, which is a flatfish, which is one of the most abundant fish in the North Sea, and haddock, which is a relative of cod, which I'm sure your listeners are aware of. For haddock, we found a higher abundance and biomass at the turbines in both wind farms compared to the reference sites, whereas this effect was only found for dab in the older Beatrice wind farm.
Interesting. So there's more to learn about this, it sounds like. Now I want to move on just to a related question, Tony. Your paper, this particular paper focused on offshore wind turbines, but
Yeah.
you have a wide-ranging awareness and knowledge of the literature on this subject matter. Can you tell us anything about how offshore winds impacts compared to the ecological impacts of offshore oil drilling platforms, which are also very prevalent in the North Sea there off the coast of Scotland, I think?
Yeah. So as you might imagine that there's been a lot of work, a lot more work done at oil and gas platforms in the North Sea, considering they've been around for a lot longer. And there is more studies coming. Recent studies have been published, but although it's probably not as much as you might think, but the effects are quite similar. So there was a recent study which showed that the effect at a North Sea platform, similarly, haddock, cod, those types of species were found in much higher abundance, very close to these structures. Generally, the closer you get to the structure, the higher the abundance and biomass. So generally, they found that we're getting similar type of effects of these species. There has been a recent study which would suggest that this effect at large oil and gas platforms that have been around for a long time, that this effect might be over greater distances, even up to kilometers, but generally it's in close proximity to them.
Well, let me ask you this. First of all, do you have an explanation for why the populations expand adjacent or to these offshore energy developments? And curiously, there was one type of base, wind turbine base, where there was not enough expanded population. Do you have a theory about why that would be? The big question is, number one, what is it about these offshore energy platforms? Is it waste or byproducts or something like that?
So I think in our particular study, it would suggest that for the wind turbine foundations, the particular wind turbine foundations that are at these particular sites, which are called jacket foundations, which are quite like a lattice structure. We think because of the type of fish that we saw, haddock and dab, which are not generally related to sort of hard substrates, they're more like mobile substrate species. We think it's a food supply availability. So we think that that's providing lots of potential food for them, and they're aggregating to feed there. But for other types of structures that are different, so monopiles for wind turbines, sometimes you might not find that they are aggregating around them because they're not producing these habitats or potential food availability. But generally, it's found that for certain species that, but not all species, that they will aggregate around these structures. I will say that our study doesn't infer that there's production of these populations. It infers that it suggests that they're definitely redistributing the population, but whether that's redistribution and production, so producing more, is a different question. and something that needs to be addressed. It's been found for some oil and gas platforms. They have done some studies which say that some of the most productive for certain fish species, but we haven't got to that level yet for offshore wind.
Okay, a couple of things for our listeners. The lattice type foundation probably allows things to grow. Would that be a correct assumption, Tony?
Yeah, just for general things like there's lots of work that's been done on things like artificial reefs, where you find that the more complexity to these sort of these structures, these habitats, that can create more space for shelter, for growth, for all that type of thing that could generate potential more organisms for food for other species. So a general rule of thumb, complexity can help with increased diversity and production. So yes, this is what we sort of inferred from our study, that the Beatrice foundations were more complex than the Moray East foundations. So potentially that could be a reason why we'd seen more of an effect at the Beatrice foundations than the Moray East.
This episode is brought to you by the Policy Resolution Group at Bracewell, where law, policy, and strategic communications intersect to help clients navigate what's next. At Bracewell, we know energy. It's the industry we serve, the power behind big ideas, and the force we bring to every challenge. For nearly 80 years, our firm has helped industry leaders tackle high-stakes challenges with creativity, precision, and results. Bracewell's DC-based Policy Resolution Group helps clients anticipate what's coming so they can shape what's possible, from chaos to clarity. Learn more at bracewell.com/PRG.
And you mentioned that where the impact wasn't quite so significant was the monopile. That's essentially just a pole stuck in the ground type of foundation, right?
That's right, yeah. And normally they'll have scour protection around them to stop, well, as it says, that scouring of that monopile. And there is studies. There was a study in Germany, I think it is, where they compared monopiles with different types of scour protection and looked at the catch per unit effort for cod. And it actually depended on what type of scour protection you had, because there's different types, like there's sandbags and there's rocks, and it actually depended on the type of scour protection as to whether it increased the catch per unit effort of cod. So there's lots of different intricacies of these different types.
Offshore wind is a relatively new technology. We've only really been building them in any kind of number, even in the UK, where it's a really big part of your energy supply. They've only been being built for maybe 10 years or so in significant scale. Sorry, go ahead. What were you going to say? I didn't mean to interrupt, Tony.
No, it's good. Yeah, and it is a very big part of going to be a very big part of our energy supply. And we're going through a whole process of areas of seabed being leased through bids, and this is continuing as we speak. So the development of the wind farms is only going to get larger around the UK coast, and that's the same with the European waters as well.
Just out of curiosity, the projects that you studied off Scotland, were either of those the project that Donald Trump objected to so rigorously way back in 2013 to 2015?
No. I think that was off the Aberdeenshire coast, isn't it? Is that where his golf course is?
And it wasn't very far off the coast. These are probably projects that are pretty far out to sea, right?
Yeah. So they're between I think 7.5 nautical miles and 23 nautical miles offshore.
And that project that President Trump had so much trouble with was only a couple of miles offshore. It's really a different industry today than it was then, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. It's expanding. In the thing is with especially in the UK is it's happening. It's what we're going through really is to try and understand how to mitigate the effects. How to, that it is going to happen. And obviously they have to go through the environmental impact assessments to get consenting, etc. So it goes through that whole sort of process. But what we're trying to do is trying to understand the effects and how this can help with the future consenting, understanding of these effects, whether it's on fish and how that might affect their predators, but trying to help this whole consenting process and getting things in the water.
Well, I want to widen the conversation out just a little bit before we end it. But it's worth noting that your findings and other findings don't show any significant harms from the offshore wind projects. Research by the National Oceanic, let me say this correctly, Tony. Research by the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration here in the U.S. found that there's no scientific evidence that offshore wind causes whale deaths, and that vessel strikes and entanglement in fishing gear are the greatest human threats to large whales. Now, your research focused, at least this paper, focused on haddock and flatfish. But can you tell us just a little bit about what other research might show on the impacts of offshore wind on other fish populations?
Yeah, so as we mentioned, it's in the UK, it's a reasonably new industry, but the other European countries in the north that have waters in the North Sea, they've had wind farms there for a bit longer. So in Belgium and Netherlands and Denmark, and so they've done studies looking at different types of fish in their areas, and they're finding similar type things. So there's been some tracking studies done of cod and plaice around a Belgian wind farm, where they found, again with plaice, which is a flatfish, which you might not expect them to be so concerned with, hard substrate, etc. Well, they found through tracking studies that they actually move in and out during the daily cycle, using these sort of scour protection areas for maybe shelter and feeding opportunities. So that's another flatfish that's been affected. Also the cods, which is sort of quite renowned for being associated with with reef habitat. They found they're highly resident around these turbine foundations. So there's quite a few studies being done or have been done in these other European countries.
Interesting. Okay, one last question, Tony, before we close it out. Are there next steps? It sounds like most of the findings are showing that, like most life, these fish populations are adapting. Are there next steps in helping to understand the impacts of ocean energy development on marine populations? Are there next steps in research on the subject?
Yeah, I would go back initially for fish populations. I would go back again and say we need to understand whether it's production as well as just redistributing these fish. And I think that's quite important because as we've seen with the sort of oil and gas decommissioning debates on how it should be done and what these effects will be, then you sort of want to know the really intricacies of whether it is having like actual population level effects for fish. And once I think you get to that understanding, you've also got to take into consideration, and research things like, are these effects influencing ecosystem function? Because fish aren't in isolation, they're part of communities, they're part of food webs. And so how potentially, if you are producing more fish, certain species, how are these interacting? How are they being used as prey? Whether that redistribution or production is affecting the animals that feed on them, such as sharks and marine mammals. And and that's something that we're trying to do as part of this prepared project. So these data that we have published in our paper are also being used as like the prey information to look at porpoise and seal presence around these wind farms. So that's another area which is really interesting, and I think we could take further. But also this all needs to be under the sort of overarching climate change umbrella of like we can look at these changes in fish populations in a local scale and maybe at a regional scale, but we also need to consider that, you know, marine heat waves are happening, ocean temperatures are increasing, species distribution is changing. So all of that needs to be taken into consideration, and it's not an insignificant task to disentangle all that.
To say the least. I don't want to go any farther in that direction, Tony. This has been a great conversation. I think what it's highlighted is the complexity of trying to produce energy for literally billions of people, not, you know, whether it's in the UK, the US, wherever, China. You can't really have energy produced at that scale without having impacts. And the best it seems like we can do is to understand what our choices are. Do you think that's a fair observation? It's kind of a yes or no question, but please briefly.
No, I absolutely agree. You know, I am very on board, you know, with we need to get renewable energy, you know, wind farms in the water. We need to understand how that might impact the environment, because it will. I actually think not being funny, the US is in a position where if it was to move forward with this offshore wind, you can learn a lot from what's going on in Europe and the Far East. You know, China are putting lots of wind farms in the water, and you could learn a lot from what we're going through at the moment. You know,
Excellent, excellent. I think the U.S. has a lot to learn about a lot of things, Tony, but that's all the time we have. I want to thank my guest, marine ecologist Anthony W.J. Bicknell, a senior research fellow at the UK's University of Exeter, for his highly informed insights into the impact of offshore energy development on ocean life habitats and habits. I also want to thank our sponsor, Bracewell LLP. And as always, I want to thank our listeners for taking the time to check out the USEA Power Sector Podcast. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and share with everybody you know our quest for energy transition solutions.